Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Well, the foreign policy scene is just rife with chaos, whether we're talking about the political dynamic in the U.S. and how that relates, or whether we're talking about funding and current disasters, or just ongoing regime changes around the world. We've been highlighting a lot of how this might connect the discussion of Israel and Zionism and a lot of really deep conversations. So I'm honored today to have on Dan Cohen, founder of Uncaptured Media, to discuss just how he sees all this fitting together, and or maybe not, or how, just simply why this is important for us to be paying attention to, and how many lies there are surrounding just about everything we're going to talk about today. So Dan, thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for having me on again, Ryan.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. I think you're a very insightful person in this conversation, and I think it's your take on this tends to be what I gravitate towards. Objective, nonpartisan, and I think that's something we should all be striving for. So I'd like to start today with just a general point around, right now I think the election, and I think unfortunately so, even from the rest of the world, the U.S. election dynamic seems to kind of overtake a lot of things. And I tend to think it's a lot more of a distraction. In my opinion, my audience is well aware of about whether this even translates to the outcome. But I want your just general thoughts on how it relates to foreign policy right now with, at least in my opinion, whether Kamala, Biden, Trump, or RFK, or any of it. It all kind of seems to be leaning in the same direction. Now, I'd like your thoughts on if you agree with that and how you see, and really, I guess, what that might mean for the voters out there in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think, domestically, people, it seems to me, at least I live in Washington, D.C., but just observing, which is obviously extremely blue, like I'm in the belly of the beast. But I think people are not terribly excited for either candidate. It's, the 2016, whether, that era, whether it was like the Bernie movement or the Trump, the Trump movement, I think those illusions have sort of disappeared. And I think, if it is an actual free and fair election, if it were counted by the popular vote, probably Trump would win. I mean, but, with that first debate, at his debate with Kamala, I don't think he looked particularly strong. I thought, the more recent debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, Vance looked stronger, and Tim Walz just looked totally out of sorts. And I mean, his body language was just incredible. I mean, that was a meme all over Twitter. But, nonetheless, I think people are not really buying in to, they're looking for an alternative, and there's not a huge amount of excitement about either party, broadly speaking. What that means, there's so much that can happen. I mean, the way that both parties really have undermined people's trust in the system, between, the Democrats saying in 2016 when Hillary lost to Trump that Russia put him in power, and then Trump when he lost in 2020 saying that was a rigged election, which whether it's true or not, whatever the merit may be, there's just so much there's just such a lack of trust, and I feel like the political parties have the country very polarized and divided. I mean, the cultural difference between rural America and the cities could not be starker, and I think you see that playing out in politics. And now, we're at this time of crisis with this hurricane that just did massive damage. I mean, it's an interesting, the way you kind of brought it up, it's an interesting confluence of factors. I mean, the main thing, it's in my mind, of course, the most urgent thing is the genocide in Gaza, and this and Israel escalating this war. Nuclear Israel escalating this war, and what that could lead to. On one hand, I'm so just in what's happened in the last week, Iran finally striking back, after Iran and Hezbollah basically played their hand very moderately, attempted to use the leverage that they had from the kind of space that they had from the Israel's assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, to basically where the world accepted and expected that they were going to strike Israel. In retaliation for that, they basically used that to try to pressure and negotiate with the U.S. to force Israel into a ceasefire. But the Biden administration was a complete farce all along, all of the negotiations. As I think if you look at the actions rather than the rhetoric all along, since October 7th, that's been totally abundantly clear. But, I certainly don't blame them for, they don't want to destroy themselves and see Israel destroy their countries. They have populations to look after. It's not, of course, only about the Palestinians for them, but they fundamentally know at the end of the day that Israel's gunning for regime change and to subjugate those countries too, right. Lebanon and Syria and Iran. So when Iran finally struck back and, unlike Israel, did not target civilians, I mean, it was just such an incredibly calculated and perfectly executed military operation to launch these variety of missiles at military bases in Israel, the ones that were used not only to kill the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, but also to carry out these horrible strikes in Lebanon, but also in Gaza. So it's weakening Israel's ability to not only attack neighboring countries, but to continue this genocide. So, and then just today, we learned, it was just reported on Friday, I should say, that the Iraqi resistance was able to launch a drone strike on an Israeli military position, apparently in the occupied Golan Heights, and kill 2 Israeli soldiers and wound 24 more, which I think that's unprecedented. So now basically everyone is expecting Israel to carry out some kind of attack on Iran. Right. But, which who knows what it could be. And Israel's all about using overwhelming, disproportionate force.
Right.
So it could be
a crime in and of itself. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And which is very ugly. And we've seen that, I mean, not just since October 7th, but for years and years and years. But now it's really at another level. It's surpassed even at the limits it even had set on itself before.
Right.
So what is that going to do to Iran? Quite possibly kill a lot of innocent people, but it's certainly not going to significantly diminish or degrade Iran's military capabilities, which we saw a fraction of when they launched this retaliatory attack on Israel. So I think basically Israel is, making bets that it can't cash. It's fundamentally not able to defeat the resistance, and it has no ability to de-escalate because of its own internal sort of dynamics, its own ideology and this kind of thing. So
I mean, I would just call it desperation and dishonesty. I mean, they've built an entire illusion around their identity, right? I'm talking about Israeli government, everything about it, to this point to where, your narrative is you're the one defending for the moral, acting within the law, which we all see that's not true. And then whether Iran has been doing that in its history, which I would disagree with, in fact, by and large, they choose to calculate it and make sure we're only aiming at these military sources, which everyone can acknowledge. And all they can do is just continue the narrative. Lie, they hit civilians, we didn't, and it just continues to snowball. I don't see how they can pull their way out of it. They've already trapped themselves in it. But let's come back to the larger foreign policy points, because I want to touch on a few things you said first, and we'll get to all of that. I mean, I think what's interesting, we'll come back to it, is that Iran publicly warned about this, and then yet they still got through the defenses and still hit these locations. And it just shows you an interesting way that this has all gone down. And coming back to the hurricane and that conversation before we come back to the larger foreign policy point, it's interesting. So coming from the election conversation, both of every entity, it seems, kind of leaning in that same direction. So then we have the disaster. So it brings it back to a local conversation for Americans, right? And what's interesting, as you mentioned, and I want to make sure I noted on this. So you said the most urgent. And I made a point about this last night, which no matter how well I explain this, I'm sure somebody gets rubbed the wrong way, as if I'm saying that this matters more than American suffering. And however you want to play that. But like I was saying, is it's everyone out there watching or listening, you can make your own mind about what you think is more important or decide to not care about anything outside this country. That's your prerogative. But what I think is interesting is from an objective standpoint, we're talking about a genocide. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that are starving and suffering and being killed. And I just think from a human perspective, that's obviously a more important thing going on from a human perspective and suffering, right? So I just think that's important. So I agree with you. It's an urgent thing that we should all care about, especially since American tax dollars are being used to do it and it's being done in our name half the time. But coming back to the United States.
Maybe I can even add one just to expand on that a little bit. I mean, and it's also has the potential to escalate to a world war between nuclear armed powers. I mean, now Israel just struck an airbase in Syria. I think I can't remember the name of the base, but struck an airbase in Syria that the Russians had spent significant resources in, spent a huge amount of resources and blood preventing the collapse of Syria in the last decade. So now we have the potential of Russia becoming more, at least for now, indirectly involved. So this is also, it's not just about the Middle East. It's not even only about, Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Iran. We also, this is a much bigger, this is really a world war contained to that that region for the time being. So just in terms of human life that has already been destroyed and the capacity to escalate to, nuclear war or war of, not even nuclear, is a much, much greater threat. And that's not to downplay the horrors of what's happening in the Southeast right now or the total criminal negligence. But, that's just reality.
Right. And I 100% agree with you. And we'll touch on that next because it's absolutely unreal. And it's not actually, my big point last night is it's not even unique to this certain situation, which of course, a lot of partisan people are trying to make that the case, but while obviously pointing out important things, but this is just what we've seen going back from Hurricane Harvey or anything before. It's actually crazy to see how little the American government cares about its people. But yeah, but I think that, it's obviously something that is a massive point that could boil into something much larger in the world. And I think that just has to matter to everybody. And again, because our tax dollars are being spent to do this. And, but so Americans are rightly concerned about what's going on in North Carolina and Tennessee and in the greater area in there. And I think what's interesting is, again, just to that point, what's happening here demonstrates that your government, the main point that I think to highlight, and this is not to get into the valid questions about manipulation of weather, which I think is genuinely scientifically real, or other things we could talk about, but just bringing it to the real point of the discussion today, that you could list off the billions upon billions of dollars that are flying out to governments as of right now, by the way, while we now have them saying FEMA won't be able to get through the next hurricane season. You can add to whatever reason you might think that is. I frankly think it's everything, whether you want to talk about immigration or wars. And it's amazing to see in real time that your government's like, sorry, even though we know they could just print money if they wanted to, or use helicopters or drones or any number of things they're refusing to do, or take donations from the millions of people that want to, they're refusing. Any comment on that? I mean, it's just a crazy story from an American perspective of how they care more about foreign wars they do about Americans.
Yeah, I mean, it's worse than negligence. It's just total. It's like treasonous. It's, they're just sending incredible amounts of money all the time to fund wars that, I mean, that they're even losing. I mean, this Ukraine boondoggle, which never was fundamentally, well, I think was about victory. They did want to achieve victory in Ukraine in the sense that what victory was regime change in Russia. Was the goal of the Ukraine war. But on a secondary level, for the military industrial complex, who are just making huge amounts of money off of this and getting government contracts, it's just about keeping, a permanent war in the same way Afghanistan was, even when it became clear, early in the war, that the U.S. is not winning, that its stated goals are not going to be achieved. That's been obvious, for a long time in Ukraine too, but it's just keep it going, keep the blood flowing and the money and the contracts coming, and it's sort of the same in a way in Israel. I mean, basically the U.S. in a way, it's almost like sacrificing Israel in order to keep this going.
This being what the which part
to keep this war going, to keep the war going. And so it's huge, again, massive amounts of money going to Israel, which could not fight for like another day without blanket support from the United States, both financial, military, diplomatic, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I mean, it's, to me, when I look at, I think one of the questions that a lot of people wonder is like, why is the U.S. so attached to Israel? Why does it just support it, both parties, in such a way that it's, puts Israel's interests, what appears to be Israel's interests, ahead of American interests? And I think it's because I think it's not just the Israel lobby and the, a foreign influence operation. I think that's kind of the infrastructure of it. But I think it's something deeply ideological that our ruling class see the Israeli regime, Zionism, and what that level of power, and they want to be able to impose that anywhere. That's like their ideal model, that basically you have a class of subhumans that have no rights, no anything whatsoever, and you can discard them into, say, the Gaza Strip, and then just exterminate them at your will. I mean, I remember when Hillary Clinton was complaining about Julian Assange and said, "Can't we just drone strike him?"
Right.
This is the kind of thing. Not that the U.S. hasn't carried out, plenty of drone strikes in the last few decades, of course. But I think pound for pound, Israel it's the image that they aspire to implement. And so I think in a place like what's happening in the Southeast right now, I think North Carolina and et cetera, and Georgia, I think that it's a similar model, that those that underclass of America that's been abandoned by the political parties, by our elites. They want to basically consider them, they want to get rid of them. And so it's kind of like you take that model of Zionism, of having basically a master race, and then Untermenschen, and then undesirables, and you fit that to your paradigm. So it doesn't have to be along pseudo religious lines, which Israel's, I mean, it's national lines. It's not really religious, but they call it religious lines.
Right.
It can be about anything. It can be the unvaccinated. It can be anyone who does not comply or is seen as a weakness, or a load on the system that they want to implement. That those people can be discarded. That's why I think they actually like it.
Yeah, sorry. It's interesting you frame it that way, though. So you can see that applying to either left or right perspective, right? So it's like and so we saw this during the peak of the MAGA, MAGA supremacist, anti-Semitic, white, whatever they call them, terrorists, MAGA domestic terrorists. It just flip flops, or the left saying that you can see how this works on either side of it. During COVID-19, it was all about the people that were speaking misinformation around vaccines. And so what I actually see this as, to bring it to a global level, and this is actually how I saw it during, like, let's just say the Great Reset, which we weirdly saw like a lockstep of just everybody, China, Russia, like a very weird overlap there, that I see it as how all of these governments, and I'm sure some people would disagree. I personally see government as the problem, by and large, just government in a general sense, which is my ideological perspective. But I think that you see, like China and Russia, for example, that would be willing to kind of lean into something like that, even if it means brushing up against what they would see as their adversaries, if it gave them more power over their people. But then sort of differ on how they ultimately see that playing out, or whether it infringes on their sovereignty and the way they see it. So I just kind of see that always being the way governments operate. So I agree with you that our government is simply just kind of salivating at the level of control, even though it's now sort of imploding because they just played their hand terribly, that they would want for themselves. And I think that's really important for Americans to think about, and how both Kamala and Trump are actively like competing over who more supports Israel. So I just discussed this last night, kind of the juxtaposition of the idea of Israel killing an American, by the way, again, sort of highlighting the, America first, unless Israel's doing something, or the left ignoring it the same way, really. Indiscriminate strikes on Lebanon continue. They killed an American. And then the lithium conversation and how that might overlap with what's going on there. It's very interesting. but I wanted to overlap that with, and feel free to comment on the lithium part of it, because that is a fascinating conversation. Here's Brian Mast, a U.S. representative who somehow serves in a foreign military, and who is saying, I'm demanding Joe Biden and Kamala Harris immediately claw back the millions. Here's what's funny, by the way. He actually first posted it saying million, deleted it and reposted it with an S after millions. It's just funny to me. And says set for Gaza and divert it to American families impacted by the hurricane. Now, to be very clear, if we're going to talk about funding going away from the United States and going to the people in this country that need it, I would say that is a blanket statement for anything going anywhere outside the country, which would apply to that. But here, the point is that obviously there's billions flying out to Ukraine, to Israel. So I just wanted you to comment on what a ridiculous statement that is in that context. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just the level of absurdity is kind of amazing. I mean, I think probably your viewers know who Brian Mast is. After October 7th, he showed up in Congress wearing his Israeli military uniform, which, I mean, is just incredible that he can do that. And he wasn't, accused of being a traitor. That he's an elected official, American official, and he's wearing the military of a foreign uniform. I mean, it's so obvious. It's almost like asinine to say, like, imagine if he were wearing a Russian military uniform or Chinese or something. You can imagine
or a
the
British
backlash.
one.
Yeah. Honestly,
it'd be crazy.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, the guy is just obviously a complete puppet of his donors. But he speaks in a very fascist way too. When people were confronting him, like Code Pink would confront him, and different activists would go to Congress, and he would speak in a very, very fascist way. So he is precisely the kind of person that I think it looks at the Israeli model and is like, this is what we want. This is what we aspire to in the United States. So whatever it may be. Whether it's, if you are, quote unquote, pro Hamas, like Donald Trump has said, we're going to, crack down on pro Hamas people. And if you're not a citizen and you support Hamas, you're going to get deported and these kinds of things. It's that thing spreading into this ideology and this kind of, preference or demand for the ability to just impose fascist rule that people like Brian Mast want. And so, it just shows how, I mean, he's kind of leveraging this argument about we should, send aid we should help our own country rather than sending money overseas to fund foreign wars. He's taking that and like kind of flipping it to make it in the most absurd way possible to basically advance Israel's agenda, which is to defund UNRWA, to just totally cut off Palestinians from any kind of the most basic amount of sustenance. So, but it's so obvious because, he supports, of course, funding billions and billions to Israel and Ukraine. So, I mean, that guy's just he's just one of the worst humans on the planet.
Yeah. He's a hypocrite. I definitely agree. And what really just kind of unnerves me about the whole thing is, that obviously if of all the things we're discussing, clearly the people who are most in need in this conversation would be the people in Gaza. And to be that the only one you want to pick out of it all. But what's even more interesting is that here's Saul Rod pointing this out as of yesterday. Seems like the story should be a bigger deal. And this is from Reuters. Food aid to Gaza falls as Israel sets new rules, ultimately continuing to decrease the amount. I think it's lower than 45 trucks a day now, coming back from 500 a day before October 7th. And they were still food insecure. And so think about it, at a time when they're rolling it back more than ever, he's still going after that. I mean, it just shows you this kind of grotesque perversion of what we're really dealing with. And so let's bring this to Gaza. You recently tweeted about this, and this overlaps with Elon Musk and the censorship on Twitter. Feel free to comment on it if you'd like. But Dr. Fidel Naim posted a horrifying series of images around a school, or rather the Center for Orphans, that Israel had bombed in Gaza. While everyone's looking at Lebanon more so at this point, getting away with even more. And you simply posted, while Elon Musk and his legions of sycophants portray him as the savior of free speech, he straight up censors evidence of Israel's genocide in Gaza. So I think what we're seeing here is just this ongoing occupation, ongoing genocide, ethnic cleansing, destabilization of Gaza, and people are paying attention. I mean, I guess let's put it, the average conversation has largely shifted somewhere else. So can you give us some updates on what you see currently going on in Gaza? Do you see that going to be, is that going to be diminishing? You know, where do you see that at the moment? Because it seems like they've kind of failed there and have shifted away. How do you see it?
Yeah, man, I think for one thing, because of the war on Lebanon and the escalation there, the Israeli military is forced to shift some of its assets and its supply lines to the north. And so there's a decrease in overall Israeli military operations throughout the Gaza Strip, with largely the exception of the Philadelphia corridor, which is in the south of Gaza along the border with Egypt, which the Israeli military claims and the government claim that this is Hamas's oxygen. And so if they just occupy that area, then it will cut off Hamas and it will defeat them. But it's just a lie to maintain the war, because the resistance in Gaza is able to has certainly at this point is not degraded at all. Is still operating. It really is as a national military. There's a chain of command that's totally operating in the same way it has been since October 7th. I mean, if you want to see more, someone who discusses this in depth and pays attention to it very closely on a daily basis is John Elmer from the Electronic Intifada. I mean, I really enjoy his streams where he discusses and analyzes this stuff. But that's certainly that's the reality in Gaza. And so as Israel has shifted towards Lebanon and shifted its ground forces towards the north, it has basically continued bombing Gaza. It's just going to continue to basically thin out the population essentially much as it can, just kill as many people from air, where it has total dominance, where no Israeli soldiers are going to be killed. And that's what we saw when they bombed this orphanage. It's not just an orphanage, it's an orphanage that has been that's now used as a shelter. So it's not only orphans in there, it's families who are trying to escape from the bombing, but of course nowhere is safe. So these images came out a couple nights ago, and Fadl Naim, who's from Gaza, he's a doctor from Gaza, he tweeted them, and Elon Musk, X censored them, so he reposted them, and apparently they're up until this point. So the point I'm making is just like how, since Elon Musk bought Twitter, he is constantly heralded as by people like what's his name, Michael Schellenberger, and these kind of suspicious personalities who just came to prominence in the last few years.
Around Twitter files, right? And the kind of facade that was at the end of the day, since we never really saw source material.
Right, exactly. And how selective it was, and I'm not blaming the people who Taibbi or whoever that got access to the Twitter files, but I mean, it was very obvious from the jump that it was a limited hangout, that it was going to be that it was about basically showing some dirty laundry in order to reestablish the credibility of X as the alternative media platform, where Facebook and Meta and Instagram and all these other ones are censoring. X is the place for free speech, so they want to funnel all of us into this one place. At least those who are like kind of skeptical and worried about free speech, whereas maybe your aunt and who doesn't think about that stuff is just happy on Facebook. So we're never, that stuff gets censored. I can think of so many important Palestinian and Lebanese and Iranian accounts that back in the earlier days of Twitter, 6, 7, 8 years ago, were getting censored and were just suspended, and we never learned anything about how that happened. And it's obvious, the Israel lobby or the Israeli government was handing down orders to Twitter, the old Twitter regime, but none of those accounts they were, when so many accounts were unsuspended that had been suspended during the COVID era, for example, those accounts were never unsuspended, and we never learned anything about that process of how they were suspended, why they were suspended, who ordered the suspension, who implemented it from the Twitter files. And that basically remains the case. So it's like the new Twitter is even more of kind of a psyop than the old one, which was just so much more blatant. And I think, you know, this is where we see it. And it's, I mean, and it's kind of very closely related to the broader, you know, this kind of the Trump people who, you know, claim to be anti-war, but are totally, you know, voiced support for Israel from the very beginning of this genocide, and spread all of the most heinous, you know, mass rape hoax propaganda and all this stuff, and are totally silent as this is going on. I mean, I live in DC, and I went to the Rescue the Republic rally over the weekend. I stopped by there for a couple hours, and, you know, I got a media pass, and I tried to, I waited in the media area to see if any of the kind of big hitters, RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, who else, you know, any of them would come out, or Brett Weinstein, for example, who, you know, who denounced a ceasefire in Gaza in November of last year, and also spread the mass rape hoax. You know, I tried to talk to any of them. None of them would come out of to the media area, even though 99% of the media was totally just, you know, friendly and wanted to talk to them about whatever. They just steered clear of all media. So, and none of them have anything to say about, you know, this massive escalation in the Middle East that could turn into that's a regional war and could turn into a world war. And the U.S. and the Biden administration, you know, even if they want to blame it on Biden and play red-blue politics, they could do that. But they're in bed. I mean, earlier on, I think I kind of forgot to, you know, you sort of brought up, and I forgot to talk about it. But, you know, maybe is there any difference, at least in terms of the Middle East conflagration with Kamala and Trump? And I mean, I think there is, in the sense that, you know, it's totally clear now, if it hasn't been all along, that the Biden administration, or, you know, the Biden ghost ship, their policy has just to say has been to have no distance between them and Israel, and just say the opposite of what's true. You know, we're pressure. You know, I remember in November, and I tweeted about this the other day. In November, there was a headline that Biden is getting, you know, saying that you know, the public is running out of patience, and you're going to have a ceasefire soon. You know, it's just been like lie after lie after lie. So now when I see, you know, Biden tells Netanyahu that he doesn't want to strike on Iran's, you know, nuclear reactors, that sounds like the U.S. and Israel are planning to strike Israel's, you know, nuclear reactors, whatever, nuclear sites. So that's just been the lie all along. You know, AOC saying that Kamala's, you know, working tirelessly for a ceasefire. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, and to your point before, remember that it already came out that they were lying about that to allow Nasrallah to let his guard down and so they could kill him, or to use the United Nations or the ceasefire so they're using the lie to actually carry out illegal actions, like, just to add to your point. It's crazy.
Exactly. This good cop, bad cop routine. And now everyone sees through it. And the Iranians and the Lebanese, you know, I think now, even if they were skeptical before, now it's like, okay, it's totally obvious. It's undeniable. And so that's why, you know, Iran basically said, okay, so we have to attack, and they did. Whereas, you know, the Trump is more unpredictable. He's like a walking contradiction. You know, he'll say he said, like, we're gonna destroy Iran, and he, you know, foams at the mouth and says this stuff. But then, you know, he'll say, I'm gonna lift the sanctions on Russia. You know, and it's like, this is not how the machine works, Donald. You know, like, you know, he's got Kushner, Jared Kushner, the ultra Zionist, you know, his ultra Zionist son-in-law, like, basically picking out his appointments. So I think what is more likely to happen if Trump were to win is he'll totally support the genocide. He'll probably, I think he might, you know, maybe he would give Israel something bigger, you know, symbolic, like allow them to annex the West Bank, something like that, officially annex the West Bank.
Miriam did pay him for it, so
right, yeah, exactly. $100 million from Miriam Adelson, who's whose late husband Sheldon said he wants to nuke Iran. So what does Tulsi Gabbard have to say about that? Isn't she supposedly anti-war?
RFK, yeah, same
RFK,
thing.
Any of these people who pretend to oppose neocons, and now they are like fully in support of the quintessential neocon issue.
Which is funny now. They're pretending that the left has become the neocon, which doesn't even make sense. I mean, it hasn't made sense for a really long time, but it's just becoming clumsier and clumsier as this drives forward. I mean, the point is we got like Cheney and others that are joining the left. It just, I personally see it all as the same thing, but I think it just I think they're desperate moves of trying to get people to perceive these things as you were just highlighting. But whether it's the rally or they want them to be perceived as the outsider, even though it's packed with elitists, oligarchs, and technocrats.
Right.
And I wanted to add too about Twitter and ADL. The point is that, despite all the changes, I agree with you that it is definitely more surreptitious than I think ever in very different ways. But they don't forget that even Yacarino from the World Economic Forum and the rest, they're partnered with ADL. They're actively still doing that in regard to Israel and censoring stuff. And they've made that very clear. And then on top of that, to the rally, which I'm sure you saw, the only one to even bring Israel up was Jimmy Dore. And if you watch the clip, it went over like a wet towel. Like they were like, yay, like barely clapping. And he was even making a valid point, not even necessarily about Israel, but simply that free speech matters, right? So we should care that they were just like barely clapping. And it just shows you that if they can't even get on board with that, it's not even all, it's because of the narratives and it's coming from the rulership of it all. And I agree with you. You have a comment there? Otherwise, let's bring it into.
No, I think you're right. I mean, the one other thing I would say about Trump is because Trump is such a contradiction, I almost wonder. They know exactly what they're going to get with Biden and Jake Sullivan and Blinken, and Netanyahu will pretend to oppose them, and they're holding up weapons delivery, so it's this whole charade where there's actually no distance at all,
or no holding up of shipments. Right? There's like one.
Right. Right. I think I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I almost wonder with Trump is if it's like for the Israel lobby or for, they are like, keep your enemies, you keep your friends close and your enemies closer, because they're like, look, Trump, he'll listen to Tucker Carlson sometimes, and Tucker Carlson told him not to go to war with Iran and he didn't do it. So when, after the Pentagon, basically General Milley convinced Trump to assassinate General Soleimani, and then Iran attacked the American airbase in Iraq, then it was basically like, okay, is the U.S. going to launch, going to escalate even more? And he had Trump had John Bolton on one shoulder and Tucker Carlson on the other. And he listened to Tucker Carlson, and Tucker Carlson, even to this point, is saying, this whole stupid story about Iran wanting to assassinate Trump that was obviously false from the start, but in the last couple of days was confirmed as false. And Tucker Carlson said, no, obviously this is phony. So he's like, he has the devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other. And that's, that's not to say I agree with everything Tucker Carlson says. There's, many criticisms, but at least in that sense of like, are we going to launch a war on Iran that's going to destroy all of our, energy infrastructure and military assets in the region and collapse the global energy markets? And he decided not to, because he has, he's not from the DC cult. So I guess I really wonder, is Israel's real strategy to have your friends close but your enemies closer, because maybe they know that Trump is like less of a sure thing.
It's interesting.
Maybe I'm wrong.
See the logic. No, I definitely see the logic. It really comes down to the fact that none of us really know what they're thinking or feel or their intentions, right? We're basing on their actions, and that definitely logically could line up. I would say that more so, like, first of all, I think you would agree the assassination of Soleimani itself could have easily spun out into a war right off the bat. And so like the argument that, like, the point is right there when they try to claim he didn't start new wars, like, so the Venezuela coup attempt could have done the same thing, right? So it's easy to see these things just because they didn't doesn't mean that couldn't have been the same outcome. But what I think is interesting is that he just let out recently more than once, and it's the same thing Israel does, that because now it works for Trump to say, well, no, Iran's reached out and let us know, even if it was a lie now, or, who knows where the lie plays in. Because back then, remember, the point was, we defeated them. They're weak. They didn't get a good hit in. That's why nobody was killed. Well, now twice in different interviews, Trump is saying, no, Iran let me know. They said, we're going to bomb outside. And that's why I was there. He's trying to frame himself as at the other side of it now, which is the same thing Israel's doing, right? Iran let them know. And we'll touch on in a second, but then ultimately still tries to make it sound like they're so weak they couldn't even get a shot through, which even wasn't the case. So to me, it's sort of the false duopoly or the paradigm, the idea that Tucker and to me, I think that's a false paradigm, right? That ultimately I think that it's about either, as opposed to just not having foreign wars or foreign invasions, it's about we destroy them or we carry on the psychological war, right? That's the two things that are being decided against. But I do agree with you, and I hope you're right. I hope that Trump, I would agree, is the wild card. I think his hubris can guide him to say things that are bombastic and clumsy, like coming out and saying things like Israel used to control Congress, and rightfully so. He just said that in an interview. And I don't think he should have said that. They're probably like, damn it, Trump, you're saying too much, right? But I think that's where I would read that. And so at the end of the day, how this goes forward, I would hope that's correct, but I think either one represents the continuation of the same problem, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I think the thing is with Trump is has the possibility to, he'll, like the Democrats are going to just try and maintain the charade as long as possible, which is what they've done to this point. And now that's basically running out. And so if Trump comes in, he'll say, oh, I'm going to end this thing by just giving Israel everything they want, So right. I'm not going to talk about this phony 2-state solution like the Democrats. I'm going to, we're going to have, Israel from the river to the sea or whatever, and annex the West Bank, and the Israeli public and the Israeli right wing is going to love it. And it's going to be a big feather in Netanyahu's cap for like 15 minutes until, the whole thing falls apart. Right. So I think Trump could be the figure that basically, gives Israel its kind of like last shot of whiskey before it like collapses on the floor. There, right. It's that. Good way to put that possibility. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes perfect sense. I mean, in a way, like you said, that could even be more calculated to be to me see that change. But I agree. I think that the problem is that either one of them support the end game of Israel, or at least are for whatever reason incapacitated or influenced enough to allow it. And it really does worry me. But again, I think we should all be hoping that the outcome, like it's weird how people in the paradigm will almost want the country to fail because they don't like Trump, as opposed to just hoping that he is the person they want him to be. It's like we should all be hoping that they all actively are the ones that their people think that they are. I just personally don't think that's the case. And going into Lebanon here, I think it's the same dynamic. I mean, maybe you could wrap your mind around out there listening that they just didn't see what's going on in Gaza, which I just frankly don't think is possible. But now this has shifted to Lebanon. Right. And again, as Robert's written about, I mean, and by the way, same point, it didn't begin on October 7th. This has been going on a long time. It's an occupied territory as well, as you know well. But now they've shifted the narrative. The genocide is now expanded into, now they're just carpet bombing Lebanon and bombing civilian locations. As I wrote here, Israel caught massacring Lebanese civilians under the same false claim of tunnels under their homes. And so if you just talk about that shift in there and what that does to this dynamic now, because I mean, obviously this is, and my point, what I was starting with there is that how in the world you could pretend like this is not what I just said, and then how they could continue to ignore this. This is not Gaza. This is not the conversation of hostages and held and, and what happened on October 7th. This is a local, a civilian location where there's lots of people filming this, where you'll be able to prove the claims after the case. I just don't see how they see this going forward unless the U.S., either side of it, are involved with taking the territory entirely. That's kind of what I see coming from this. So what are your thoughts before I go further?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in Israel, it's interesting because the ongoing war on Gaza is, there's, division in Israeli society because of the captives, the prisoners of war that are in Gaza. And so people that normally would totally support just bombing Gaza to smithereens are basically, there's, say roughly half the country who is basically like, no, we need a ceasefire, just for a day to get all those captives out, and then we go back to bombing them. But they want a ceasefire. They don't understand that once there's a ceasefire, that's, Israel has lost. And that's what the right wing gets, is like, no, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. So where there's division in Israeli society over Gaza, with Lebanon, it's basically everyone in Israel supports this war because, they see, Hezbollah's presented this threat for so long. Why does Hezbollah exist? Well, from the Israeli occupation in the 1980s that went up until 2000, and then Israel invaded again in 2006. So,
Right.
and not only because of the Israeli occupation, that's why it was born, but of course it played a major role in preventing the collapse of Syria and fighting, Takfiri militias and CIA warlords there that threatened that would have not only collapsed Syria, but would have collapsed Lebanon too, and would have been genocide against all religious minorities, et cetera, or ethnic minorities. So in Israeli society, everyone supports this war. It's pretty amazing. And
Would you
so
say they support the civilian deaths? Is that, I would agree. What do you think on that?
Oh yeah, they totally support it. I mean, they see it as like, this is we took out, everyone's focused on, they took out Nasrallah, and when they dropped, there's one Israeli report in Israel's Channel 12 that said 83 munitions, which are basically 1 ton or 2,000 pound bombs, 83 of those. And then there's another report in the Jerusalem Post where a senior Israeli Air Force official said they dropped about 100. So that is just unprecedented in like modern history. That amount of explosives dropped on one place. It's they hadn't done anything like that before. They haven't done anything like that in Gaza. So the amount of destruction that Israel is carrying out in Beirut, particularly in the Dahia neighborhood, where Hezbollah has its base of support, is just an incredible crime, a war crime against humanity, and the amount of civilians that they've just been slaughtering is just shocking. And also throughout villages in southern Lebanon. Again, through this whole just moronic propaganda campaign that the missiles are in people's kitchens. These like 30-foot missiles are in these kitchens, and that's where they're going to launch them from. So that's why we have to destroy these houses. So I mean, in Israel, there's total consensus for it. In the U.S., I mean, keep in mind, the U.S. has very much wanted to destroy Hezbollah for a long time, going back to the the 1983 Hezbollah bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut. I mean, the Pentagon, the generals have, pardon my language, they have a hard-on for just destroying Hezbollah, which is blowing up Lebanon and just making Lebanon suffer. So it's not as if it's like only an Israeli thing that they want to take them out, but at the same time, I think the Pentagon, of course, knows that starting a war in Lebanon can easily escalate, and so they've been basically, I think the calculus has been, let's do this good cop, bad cop thing where we'll publicly say, well, we don't know if we're going to be able to, it's going to be really hard to help you, Israel. And then just like, and lull Hezbollah and Iran asleep. And then when they're, they're not expecting it, launch this major strike, and that will like decapitate them and degrade Hezbollah. Now, so they killed like the entire senior leadership of Hezbollah, not only Nasrallah, but it's something like the top 17 guys. But what they don't understand is that, yes, that was a shocking day, but it doesn't fundamentally degrade Hezbollah's military capabilities. It's a very horizontal, it's very horizontal in its structure. And Nasrallah has been the leader of the Secretary General of Hezbollah for most of its existence, going back to the early 90s when they killed the founder, when Israel killed the founder of Hezbollah, and Nasrallah replaced him. So, since he was kind of a young man, he's been the Secretary General, and he is very much in the, he's like a father figure for a lot of, Lebanese, not only, Shia, but Lebanese, patriots in general. And so for Israel to just assassinate him in this way too, in such a cowardly act of mass destruction, the shock is going to wear off real quick. And, that kind of, the ice has been broken, and now every single Hezbollah fighter is like just waiting for their opportunity. And we saw when Israel tried to invade, they got 8 soldiers smoked in a second of, supposedly like they're special operations guys. There's
then just turned around and murdered a bunch of people in Gaza, right? Essentially as a retaliation.
Exactly.
But briefly, is there any indication you see that the claim that they killed that many Hezbollah members might just be a ploy? Now, I don't have any real reason to think that, but I just thought it was interesting that there might be I do. The original point was there was a report both from Iranian media, but then actual journalists on the ground that were claiming Nasrallah hadn't been killed. But then it quickly turned out that they claimed he was. But any thoughts on if that might be some kind of a ploy for something future act?
I mean, I doubt it. I don't think that Hezbollah would try to pull some trickery about, some kind of psyop about their leadership being killed. And there was, a piece that came out about the guy who found Nasrallah and he was still alive, and he basically put his oxygen mask on.
That's why.
On Nasrallah in order to save him, and he sacrificed himself, and Nasrallah ended up dying too. So I haven't seen any indication. What I have seen in the last 24 hours is the Israelis are reporting that they've killed, like 300 or 600 or something Hezbollah members in the last week, which I think is, I don't think, I haven't seen any evidence of that. Anything to substantiate that. What's that?
Well, they tend to, really in any war situation, as you know, both sides tend to kind of either decrease or overshoot the number to, usually someone in the middle. But let me ask you this. So what is Hezbollah? Is there more to just a military aspect of it? And are they terrorists?
Well, it's a political party. Certainly their origin is as a resistance, a military resistance to the Israeli occupation. But I don't want to say that I'm an expert on this subject, but from what, everything I've read, everything I understand about Hezbollah and kind of what I see is that where, Lebanon has basically been in many ways a kind of aid state for decades. Hezbollah has filled that gap in a lot of ways, at least in the south of Lebanon, and has become one of the most important political forces in Lebanon, and certainly the most militarily capable, and defended Lebanon's sovereignty. So it's not when people say it's a terrorist group, what terrorism does it carry out? It was killing literal terrorists in Syria, who were totally dedicated to collapsing the government and imposing some kind of Wahhabi style, ISIS caliphate, and exterminating minorities. And, and in terms of what it does to, what has it done since October 7th, for example, to Israel? It is specifically, I don't know about 100%, but almost exclusively hit military targets in order to degrade Israel's military capabilities, in solidarity with Gaza, which has been, suffering, of course, genocide. So, only the Israeli and U.S. governments and maybe the mainstream media would say it's a terrorist organization, but it's, I don't think by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, here's a good point to add to that. And so my thought, the point is that people don't, I discussed this recently, that there's more than just a military wing for people to understand that there's other aspects of it. So when they just bomb anything Hezbollah, there's as any warfare that's about military active, entities. But then on top of that, the idea being that if you're going to, just a blanket statement, if you're going to pretend that this group is a terrorist organization, let's pretend that everything they've ever claimed about them is true. By that same metric, then the U.S. government, the Israeli government, would be the biggest terror organization in the world. Using that same metric, even if the claims they say are true, what the U.S. military has done around the world is exponentially, documentably worse. So I find that really interesting that it's an unequal point. But another good point to add to that, and I'm sure you saw this, it's been, even CNN just reported this, and it was even brought up in front of Matt Miller, which he just kind of shrugged it off like usual, but that apparently they entered into a 21-day ceasefire with Hezbollah. And then they use that cover to attack and kill people, right? And so it just shows you that whether you think people out there can decide for themselves what you think a terrorist is and whether that applies to them. But I would argue apply your logic equally. And the point being, if they're the ones agreeing to these deals and they're the ones acting underneath it, I mean, or even with Iran, as we pointed out, which we could talk about, being the warning them, clearly trying to de-escalate, give them an opportunity to step back. Like I said in my tweet, that's the adult in the room. Whatever you think about them, that's not good or bad guy. That's just showing you who seems to truly want this to be pulled back from the precipice. And I find that to be just incredible and obvious. But I wanted to ask your point about the occupation of this. And so this is, I'm going to play this clip really quickly. It's the first time I've seen this being stated so explicitly, but I think you might have seen, well, actually first, this is, Hadi posted this, and you might have seen this. There's now the official settler movement is now posting flyers about occupying Lebanon. They have graphs now showing the different names of the locations in southern Lebanon where they're going to be occupying. I mean, it's all very real, right? So it's obvious that's a part of the conversation. And then I saw this clip today, and I'll just play this really quickly. This is somebody, it looks like on the Caroline Glick show, and she's simply saying that Lebanon is not a real country, just like we heard about Gaza. Some of your thoughts on this?
To talk about Lebanon, because there's no such state as Lebanon. It is a forward operating base of the Revolutionary Guard Corps that has 4 million people living on it, who call themselves Lebanese and pretend that they live in a country. They don't live in a country. They live on a forward operating base of the Revolutionary Guard Corps against Israel. Right? But
all right.
That's the gist of it. He gives his opinion on it. And so I just think that's really fascinating that we're at a point now where we're just not only the human shields, tunnels under every home, jets in their living room. They just kind of going, well, they don't even exist now. Can we go with that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Okay. So I actually was in Israel recently, filming for this documentary, and I interviewed the family, the parents of a soldier who was killed in Gaza, who they are part of that movement. That to conquer and settle southern Lebanon. I haven't talked about this publicly, so I've been keeping it under wraps. But I think here it's fine to talk about. I don't think it's going to reach their ears and kind of blow my cover. At least I hope not. But that movement is a, it's they founded it several months ago, early on in the war. And their whole idea is, yes, to ethnically cleanse southern Lebanon, build settlements there, and install a collaborator regime. Like there was the South Lebanese Army during the Israeli occupation, which was basically a collaborator regime of the Israelis that had prisons they ran and these kinds of things to torture anyone suspected to be affiliated with resistance, whatever. So they want to reimpose this kind of thing, and not only to conquer, but build settlements. And so, yeah, I think other people have shown these images of like fancy condos, and we're going to sell them in southern Lebanon, the same way that they talked about in Gaza. Right. And so, southern Lebanon is in Judaism, there is the biblical land of Israel, which is, Palestine, southern Lebanon, and it is holy land for Jews. It is, regardless of who controls it, whether it's, the Ottomans or the French or, the French mandate or whatever, or the Israelis or the Lebanese, it is considered holy land. That doesn't imply any claim to sovereignty or anything like that. It's just land that's, considered
as it is for Muslims and Christians as well, right? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Right.
This is the Holy Land. Exactly. So Zionists from basically the beginning have, the whole concept of Zionism was to nationalize the religion. So to empty it of all theological meaning, all religious meaning, and to turn it and to fill it in with, 19th century European nationalism. And to transform Jews into a nationality from a religion, to abandon everything about God and all this stuff and just be basically fascist nationalists. And David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, two of the early Zionist leaders, Ben-Gurion, of course, who became the first prime minister of Israel, they in the 1910s, I'd have to look exactly what year, they wanted to include southern Lebanon as part of their proposed state. Right. that didn't happen because of Sykes-Picot. So they didn't end up getting it, but they wanted it, and they saw the Litani River as a natural border, which runs basically east-west. And to this day, there is a faction or a kind of ideological stream in Zionism that they've always coveted this, and that kind of is bursting forth now. So this movement that began was officially established not long after the Gaza war started, the genocide on Gaza. It was just on the back burner. It was kind of marginal because the Lebanon war wasn't, at front and center. But what's happened is you have a huge amount of Israelis who are displaced from northern Israel, from the Galilee, and are living in hotels funded by the government and around Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and are just living in terrible conditions, and they want to go home. And many of them are very right wing, and they demand that the Israeli government destroy Hezbollah. Okay, they are, for their own security reasons, they embrace this too, and they say the logic that they tend to present is, we can't live in northern Israel, we can't return to our settlements in northern Israel unless there is a buffer zone inside Lebanon. So we have to clear basically southern Lebanon. Now, you've basically done like 90% at that point of what the settlers who want to, who think this is their ancestors' land and we have to conquer it and build settlements. And this is not this isn't about security. Security is secondary. For them, it's the same, but first and foremost, it's because this is land that was literally, given to us by God. So that is now becoming a much more...
Sorry.
What's that?
Okay. Or the British government, but go ahead.
right. Or the British government, whatever. Same thing. So now this, what began as kind of this marginal stream around, maybe December, January 2024, has suddenly become a kind of, a flood or a major, there's a huge amount of support for it in Israeli society, especially as, the entire country supports going to war against Lebanon. So maybe half or most Israelis see it as like a security thing, but it just becomes synonymous for, this is like we're conquering this land for God because God gave it to us. But I'm actually finishing a piece on this right now. I'm going to publish hopefully, in the next, over the weekend or I don't know, as soon as I can. But it's, I basically show how this broad support has come to be, how this has developed. I forgot exactly what I was going to say, but basically you see how this movement has unfolded. Oh, one of the things that one of the parts you'll see in the piece is there's this group of reservists who are ultra hawkish, and they basically lay out a plan. Here's where it gets really interesting, actually. They lay out a plan for what they say is, a very fast victory in Lebanon. And I think this is a totally delusional plan, but it just goes to show how poor their understanding of reality is and how detached they are. Basically, what they say is they correctly understand that Israel is now in a multi-front war that threatens its existence. And if they get into a prolonged war in Lebanon, that can be the end of the state of Israel. So what they say is we need to, instead of like, okay, let's take a step back from the brink and let's negotiate a ceasefire and go lick our wounds for a year and then think about, what we're going to do. They say, no, we need to go to the next level. We need to have a very fast victory in Lebanon. Which, and they say, like, they lay out a series of steps, like four parts. And one of them, I think the second one is we're going to bypass the Hezbollah fighters on the ground in the border. how, how are they going to, how do you just bypass that? Like, we'll just skip over that part. It's like,
Right.
I'm going to do this test and I'm just going to skip over part B because I didn't study that. I don't have any.
If I can comment, this is just so funny to me because one thing I keep highlighting about just the way that they present themselves, whether it's the Knesset or leadership and rulership, I get the sense that these are people that didn't earn the power that they have, right? It's like this kind of childish way. And what you're highlighting there is it's like step one, win the war. It's like
right.
What you're writing. Right. And I don't think, it could just be like a propaganda element, but I think it's more about the fact that they don't really grasp the true seriousness of the situation. That's my personal opinion, but I just had a comment. I think that's crazy.
No, I think it's you're right. They have, they're products of their own. It's like they're getting high on their own supply. They're like, they're not. They don't understand reality that's going. What's going on around them. They don't understand the natives to the region. So they think that like, we're just going to beat them so hard that they're going to decide to stop resisting. They're just going to bow their heads to us. And, we're going to go back to what it was, in 1967 or whatever it is. But the rules, the situation, the equation has completely changed. And that formula does not work anymore. So the more that they try to, just fight and fight and fight, and we're just going to hit harder, the faster they're going to lose. There's nothing, I think probably, for those like Hezbollah resistance fighters, there's nothing they want more than the Israelis to try and invade. That's their strength. Right. That's what they've been preparing for years and years and years. So, they're like, yes, please come in. We are going to smoke you guys. And that's, the trap that Israel is walking into. And it cannot only bomb, this document that this group released, this reservist group, they say the destruction of Dahia. They want to destroy the Dahia district of Beirut, and that's what Israel is doing. But even if you do that, that doesn't change the question of southern Lebanon, which is what they want to occupy and ethnically cleanse and colonize, which requires a ground invasion. And so no matter how many babies and kids and moms and dads they kill in Beirut itself, at some point their logic is going to make them really try to enter southern Lebanon. And when they tried it the other day, it just immediately went terribly for them. And that's like, they're an incredibly sophisticated and capable fighting force that Israel's just not ready for. And Israel, last thing is they've been, Israel's been in a protracted war in Gaza. They can't even beat, Hamas, which has less experience than Hezbollah and is under siege. So certainly, and that war is still ongoing. They're still, losing soldiers there, expending resources. Their economy is just hemorrhaging. It's, they've been downgraded by the major, internet or American credit rating agencies, by Moody's and by S&P. So, these little victories that Israel thinks it's getting by like taking out, blocks in Beirut and like bombing orphanages in Gaza, it's just all an illusion for them. Not only are you just killing people, but there's nothing. It doesn't actually gain them anything. It just weakens them. Exactly.
And look, one of the most common characteristics I've seen in history from supremacist mindsets is that they don't recognize that they're weak, or rather overestimate their own power and influence. And we're exactly seeing that. I would even say from the government, maybe save for the indication of Netanyahu shaking hands while he's reading that piece of paper, but he senses something, just to point that out. But I think ultimately, just like any historical thing, fascism, whatever, we can see that kind of same decline where it's that, death throes to the very end, kind of dying animal in the corner kind of scenario. And I will point out that, back to this one actually, that what Douglas McGregor pointed out, which just because he says it doesn't make it true, but White House now pushing for regime change in Lebanon. Officials say they want to take advantage of their attacks in Hezbollah and on Hezbollah leadership. And I have seen the Lindsey Grahams of the world, who are belligerent in their own right, basically saying that. But the fact that he's claiming it's coming from the White House, I do sense that this is going to shift into some other justifying more regime change occupation. And what you just said very clearly outlines why that makes sense. Now, I'd like to finish today with the conversation of Zionism, which I definitely think is a linchpin to a lot of the stuff we're talking about. And so we don't want to start with this point here, but just in general, I want to get into, from your perspective, right, as a Jewish person yourself and what you've talked about in the past, the two sides of it, the aggressive misrepresentation of Jews in this conversation around how Jews run the world, or, that in my opinion, very clearly is a Zionist ploy in and of itself. And on the other side of it, the complete disregard for what Zionism truly is, when people saying it's racist to point out what this political organization is doing. So kind of go at that however you'd like. I just want your thoughts and the audience to hear how you view this. What is Zionism? Why is this important to what we just discussed today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually extremely relevant, and you really can't understand what Israel is if you don't understand. You can judge it by its actions and you can look at patterns, but you have to understand its ideology in order to understand, where it's going, what it really is. You have to understand what animates its actions. And it is not obviously Israel's not a normal country, and that's not because it's ultra aggressive or has so many weapons. These are, or because it bombs babies, and even those are symptoms. The occupation, the genocide, these are symptoms of the real fundamental issue, which is Zionism. It's its ideology. And I think, one of the I think we're seeing a number of kind of psyops. I think basically more and more people are, when you basically have the what Zionists believe, or what Zionists claim, that Zionism is Jewish self-determination, or is, Israel's the state of the Jews, Israel is a Jewish state. Then as people, and in the US, basically it looks like everything that the US government does and Europe does is for Israel, aka the Jews. Then some people will say, yeah, we have to support them because look at what happened to them. Look at the Holocaust, look at all the historic persecution. They're our closest ally. This is what we hear all the time from both political parties, and, they're surrounded by terrorists and all these things. But people more and more then begin to understand, wait a minute, what are we actually getting? How does America benefit from this? From, basically helping, quote unquote, the Jews by doing this stuff for the Jews. The Jews, if we accept the Zionist definition that Israel is the Jews, well then, they're actually sabotaging us. They're getting us into more and more wars that we don't benefit from at all, that actually endanger us. We're sending more and more money overseas. We're not helping the people here in our country. And look what the Jews are doing. This is like Jewish influence. That's kind of I think the psyop, the other side of the psyop. So basically, like on X, since Elon took over, I mean, really since the Gaza war started, there is a huge amount of accounts. And I kind of bookmark some of these tweets that are, openly anti-Semitic, that just, the Jews all the time. And they're capitalizing off of what Israel is doing, and
Right.
and the Zionist conflation of Jews and it's, and Israel, and Zionism. And the thing is, this actually serves Zionism because it maintains the basic it reinforces the basic Zionist definition that Israel and Jews are synonymous. So Elon Musk, early on when he took over, he said our policy is going. He said we're not going to overtly censor unless there's calls for violence. What we're going to do, what did he say? It's freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach.
Right.
So if Elon Musk, who works with the Anti-Defamation League, the Israel lobby outfit, it works with the ADL, and is close with Benjamin Netanyahu, and is a Zionist himself, if he didn't want, or whatever, the real powers that control X did not want that to be out there, that stuff would be shadow banned or silenced, or
Most definitely.
you would not be able to see. I mean, it's just viral, and these huge. There are a number of very big shady influencers who promote this stuff all the time, constantly, and I really think this is actually, well, objectively, it serves Zionism because
Right.
it reinforces this paradigm that Jews equal the state of Israel.
Can I say
And
one thing real quickly, just to add to your point?
Sure.
And so the point being is that what he outlined right there is really important. That Twitter clearly has been censoring people saying from the river to the sea, right? Or free Palestine. We have examples of that, but yet then allow overtly, Jews do this and they're controlling that. And so his point is that there's no way you can pretend that that's not an allowance kind of situation. And not only does it allow, it can continue the conflation as you're outlining, it's what Zionism wants that perception to be. So it justifies its existence through that illusion. So go ahead. I just want to make sure that was for people listening.
Precisely that. And so it's Zionists don't care if you like them. They actually want you to hate them,
right?
But only in the correct, in a certain way. They want you to think that they are Jews, or they're acting out of Judaism, or they're following the Talmud or something like that, because then that's where they derive their legitimacy from. Then they can say, well, you're an anti-Semite, you just hate Jews. The Holocaust happened because of people like you, and there's a long history of that, and this is persecution of us. When in fact, that serves their agenda. They feed on hate. These, I'll just name the Lucas Gages, the what's the twink guy, Nick Fuentes of the world. These guys that are, and Nick Fuentes, he started in the Mossad operation Daily Wire, that's very shady. Like, how did these guys, what's his name? Lucas Gage, he got banned temporarily. He got suspended for like a month. I've never seen someone get suspended for a month. I've always seen if you get suspended, you get suspended. So to me, if you've ever seen The Departed, you ever seen the movie The Departed, where Leonardo DiCaprio gets put in jail? He's a cop and he's trying to infiltrate the mob, and he gets the cops, he goes to jail for a period of time in order to give himself credibility, and then he comes out. This is, to me, what I think is happening with people like Lucas Gage, who say all this crazy stuff, who like burn the Torah or whatever he was doing, or burn the Talmud, and then say free Palestine, or talks about, we have to slay them. And then he gets suspended briefly, and then he's back. And so it makes him look like he's censored when in fact he's not. And it may be that, Lucas Gage really believes that stuff, and he's not working for the Israel lobby, but he objectively is, because the dominant paradigm, the hegemon, is not white nationalism, is not neo-Nazism, it is Zionism. So it's not like, the Zionists are serving him. He is serving the Zionists. He is an asset of Zionism, no matter how much, the more he says, Jews bad, free Palestine, the more he serves Zionism.
I'm glad you said that, because I see the same things, and I think the Nick Fuenteses of the world are a much more obvious standout red flag. But like, I have this similar thought. Like, let me just ask it in a general sense, whether Lucas Gage or anybody else, to what degree do you think that is the case? That there are people that maybe see that what they're doing as good intentions, maybe they genuinely think it, but I would agree with you, regardless, are being played by Zionism. What percentage, your opinion, but what do you think? How much of the conversation that is?
I mean, I think probably, I think with PSYOPs, generally speaking, there are a few key influencers that are, knowingly doing it, are wittingly doing it, are actual, agents. And then, they cultivate a following that is unwitting. So, again, I don't have any proof that Lucas Gage is a spook or anything like that. I'm not saying that, but objectively, he is 100% serving Zionism. He is an agent of Zionism, 100%. And he's working to, and he says, all these terrible things about Jews, and, I got to get Jews out of my life, and then free Palestine. What he's trying to do is sully the free Palestine, movement or the idea as anti-Semitic. So then it's like he's like a walking ADL report. It's like he's doing the ADL's work for it. They don't even have to, go into a bathroom stall where somebody scrawled "Free Palestine" and say that. They're like, look, we got Lucas Gage. We don't need to waste our time with that. So I see, there's a lot of that, and I think it's a total psyop. And I mean, if the irony of it all is that if you actually take the time to look at what Zionism is, it is the complete opposite of Judaism,
Right.
of
The antithesis, almost like
the
it's
complete
yeah.
100% the antithesis of Judaism. There is no greater violation of the Talmud, in fact,
Right.
than Zionism. If you look back historically, the whole logic of Zionism was to emancipate, to reject, to rebel from Orthodox Judaism as it had existed, for thousands of years. It was, let's get, this is antiquated, all this theological stuff. We don't want to be religious, pious religious people who live separately. And, they said the Zionists embraced all of the anti-Semitic stereotypes in Europe at the time about Jews, that, they're filthy and disgusting and they get attacked because look at them. And, you can read Theodore Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, had a pamphlet or a book called Mauschel, which is widely regarded as a totally anti-Semitic text. And all of the Zionist leaders at that, in the main Zionist leaders were total anti-Semites. They hated Jews for what they were, and they blamed them for the condition that Jews had been in. So what they said is, look, the way that we are going to defeat anti-Semitism is not by changing anti-Semitism. What we are going to do is change ourselves from a pious religious people of the book of God's book, and become nationalists. We're going to empty Judaism of everything theological and holy and sacred that it has been all along. We're going to completely change it and fill it with nationalism. And that was the milieu in Europe at the time, of course, around the 19th century. I mean, after the French Revolution, and then the American Revolution, the Spring of Nations, all this, that all inspired Zionists in a big way. And so they created this fake definition of Judaism. Now, that definition of Jews as a national movement, they needed if you're basically inventing a national movement, you need a mythology. We are an ancient people and all these things. So they just took the Bible and started, they basically started partway through the Bible when Joshua conquers Canaan and saw themselves as conquerors, and said, that's us. We are them. We are, the new incarnation of these biblical figures, and we are going to basically, relive this mythical era. And it's not like real in the sense of, God or any of the stuff that Jews actually, that the Jewish religion believes, but it's our national mythology. So we're going to, David Ben-Gurion, for example, he called in 1948, he called the establishment of the state of Israel the third temple, the third kingdom. He spoke in totally messianic ways, and so basically, but he didn't really believe in God, is the irony. So what they did is they put Zionism on this track of basically using this kind of like messianic language and taking from the Bible, but rejecting all of the supernatural aspects of it, and just making it into regular old nationalism. So they set this on the path that eventually it would reach a point where, there's to strengthen that point even more, there's a really fascinating book by an Israeli American professor named Shai Hazkani that I recently came across, called Dear Palestine, and it's letters from the 1948, 1947, 1948 war, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the establishment of the state of Israel. And he got his hands on letters from, people who participated in it in different ways. And one of the things that he finds is that the chief education or propaganda minister of, I think, the Israeli army's Golani brigade. I can't remember if it was Golani or Givati, but the chief guy was distributing materials, propaganda at that time among these, new Israeli soldiers, some of them who had come from, the death camps in Europe and were now, okay, you're going to fight. You're going to, they needed to instill a fighting spirit in these soldiers. And so they started telling them that, these people are Amalek. They started saying it's okay to rape. You have to kill, you can rape, you can do all these things. And it's the same thing that's being said today. So where a lot of people, and this is partially true, say that Israel has become so much more right-wing. It's like the extreme religious right-wing that has taken over. Yes, that is true. However, that was always there. Zionism always relied on this, talk about Amalek, going back at least to, that's the first instance of it in the Israeli army, where they're openly using, genocidal language in order to motivate the soldiers. Now they don't really, have as much of that problem today, but basically what it did is so this whole logic of Zionism taking Judaism and nationalizing it, completely changing it into a national movement, and using the Bible as a mythology, it set Zionism on this track of, well, fundamentally Judaism is a religion. And so there was a small strain of Zionists led by a guy named Rabbi Kook around the turn of the century, 1900, the beginning of the 20th century, who synthesized religion and Zionism. And they said, actually, no, these secular Zionists, these sinners who violate the Sabbath, who do all the things that they shouldn't do, these guys are actually building God's kingdom. And so what we will do is we will eventually take over. Once they've built the state, we will take over. And so what he came up with was this idea called the Messiah's donkey, which is a biblical term that he completely reinterpreted. And he said, the secular Zionists are the donkeys. They don't actually know why they're doing what they're doing. And we are the Messiah. And so it was a tiny stream. And after 67, that, the conquest of the holy cities in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the Temple Mount and Hebron. And, these are like the Nablus, these are like the biblical cities. Tel Aviv was not a biblical city, so it didn't stir the imagination in the same way of Zionism. When that happened, 67, everybody thought the Messiah is coming and it's all happening and we're going to build the temple. So that stream of Zionism, of religious Zionism, which basically took nationalism and just made it into a religion, that started to grow. The settlement movement was established. And after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when the establishment was discredited and the Zionist spirit was basically weakened, that's when religious Zionism really started to take over the reins. And over the decades since then, they have become the absolute hegemon in Israeli society. So that's why you see these like whack jobs, that are wearing a yarmulke and look like religious Jews and are, talking about Amalek and slaughtering, babies and putting like, they're carrying around Torahs in Gaza and, making a synagogue in some house where they like exterminated a family. This is religious Zionism, which is the absolute 100% inverse, even more than secular Zionism, from actual Judaism. So it's a very tricky thing, and you have to really examine this stuff in order to be able to deconstruct it. So really Judaism is sees these people as like idol worshipers, as like guided by Satan, these kinds of things. So so what I realized really in the past year is that the real ultimate ideological resistance to Zionism is Orthodox Judaism. I'm not an Orthodox Jew. I'm like, I grew up in a totally secular household and background, and I still live that way. But it's made me very, very interested in learning more about Orthodox Judaism so I can understand, if it's the opposite of Zionism, I want to know about that, especially as a
Right.
Jewish guy, because that's like what that's like my whatever history or whatever it is. But and that's the truth of it. And that's, you won't understand that. Yeah, that's why you see these accounts, Torah
Mhm.
Judaism, and you see these big demonstrations against, these are people who are maintaining the actual Jewish religion, not the
Right.
fanatics in Gaza, who want to settle Lebanon and kill Amalek in Gaza. In fact, Judaism says, real Orthodox Judaism says that Zionists are Amalek, is the amazing thing.
Interesting.
It doesn't mean that you go and like kill them like the same way
Right.
that Zionists talk about Amalek, because Amalek is a biblical nation that no longer exists. But the idea is that you can change your soul will become like Amalek. So it's not, it's not a call to like kill them or anything like that.
Which
But
would be
in
counter
terms
to their
of
religion, right? Which would be counter to the religion is the point, is that they wouldn't do it because
Right.
that would be against their religion. But
precisely.
what's interesting is I'll show this. I was saying while you were talking, Muhammad Shihada just shared this. 12 years before October 7th, you maybe pronounce his name better than I could, ran an article calling to build extermination camps for Amalek. Netanyahu made this person a Likud member, right? And so it just showing you how deep this really runs. And I do want to point out what's interesting to me is that one of the things that really stood out to me reading some of these older documents, even ones from the United Nations covering like different outlines 48 forward, like what was happening, is that there were a lot of Jewish people that were pushing back against the Zionist conversation, going like, what you're doing to these Palestinians is like basically calling it out as against their religion. And there's many examples of that. And it's just demonstrating your point that they were just forcing that in nonetheless from a counter to the Jewish population that they were arguing represented them. And so I really thank you for breaking that down for people, because it's just, it's infuriating. And I'm right there with you that like, I see people that fall for it. And some cases I think might have good intentions and are thinking this is the problem, but I still think are being completely manipulated. But I personally find it repugnant, kind of the idea. But then, at the same time, people that would call you racist for saying Zionism is doing this, and it's just people get trapped in these ideological bubbles. And it's so important that we, just like you said, or really any conversation, maybe you should do your due diligence, take time to research these things like Dan is doing. But I really, in general, I think it's probably a good place to wrap. But I just point out some of the things that you included in your discussions. Like you pointed out, going back a long way, that Zionism during the final solution, for example, was aligning itself with Nazi Germany, and like these classic things that people would reject without looking. But if you understand, there's actual documentation to this. And it goes back to show you that the foundations of this were rooted in manipulation, in deception. And I think that's one thing you just highlighted very well. And so I just hope people will take the time to look into your work. And other, Zachary Foster, for example, was a PhD in Palestinian history from Princeton, a very educated person on this topic. And so I just, thank you for taking the time to highlight this. And I was going to get into some other foreign policy points. Maybe we can discuss that in the future, because, we've gone pretty long so far today, but don't want to take up all your time today, Dan. I know you're busy, but thank you for breaking this down. Anything else you want to talk about before we leave, or anything you want to shout out before we wrap today?
No, I think, I appreciate you, having me on to talk about this stuff very much. I mean, I think what you just said, that, I see people who are well-meaning, who get caught up in this, people, people who I wouldn't expect, and I'm not going to name names, but I think, it's that if you do not challenge the fundamental deception, the big lie of Zionism, that it equals Judaism, if you don't take the time to examine that, then you will basically inevitably, as Israel does what it does, you're going to be like, man, these Jews, like, I like Dan a lot, but, he's like the one exception, or whatever, these Jews are insane. And, but that's exactly what they want you to do. Even it may be a sinking ship for them, because reality is going to sink in that, they're not able to militarily dominate the region. But, I mean, I live in DC, and I was, out in, I was downtown. This is a few months ago, getting a beer with a friend who was visiting, and he wears a yarmulke. And we walk out of the bar, and some other people who were sitting next to us, they were down the street, and they yelled at us like, stop bombing Gaza or something like that. So it's like I mean, it was like ironic, because this guy's a total anti-Zionist, and, I think my position. this is what Zionism wants, is that, you turn your anger against, Jews, your Jewish neighbors, Jews, people like people in Brooklyn, who like dress different and have their insular society, or like those people, or whatever. And it's the same, it's kind of like the same anti-Muslim hysteria post 9/11. Like now
Right.
that has been turned against Jews. And, I think most people would understand that, ISIS does not equal Islam,
Right.
but it's much more, because of the success of Zionism, ISIS never reached the level that Israel did. Then, the PSYOP becomes much, much more powerful. So,
And we
I
see
think
both
it's
happening, right? Actually, from Zionism, we get the same thing as causing a lot of the right-wing conversation to be irrationally and disgustingly calling out Muslims as a problem. And it's the same
right.
thing from. And interestingly, as you say that, I'm seeing it both draw back to Zionism. That's fascinating and terrifying.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I think it's really essential to kind of, understand how. I mean, it's really just a sort of basic propaganda construct that, the same way with the Republicans and the Democrats. If we only had the Democratic Party, eventually people would get tired of that. If we just had a dictatorship, it wouldn't work as well. We need a two-party system to make people think that they are choosing, that they have some freedom.
Right.
So, you need to either say, oh, I love Israel and I love Jews and they're great and it's all the same thing, or I hate Israel and I hate Jews and they're terrible because look what they're doing and it's all the same. As long as you stay within
Right.
those two, somewhere in between, then as far as Zionists are concerned, you are perfectly good. They're happy.
Right.
If you break out of that and you realize that Judaism and Zionism are actually opposites, then what you end up doing is, you pull the curtain back on the whole thing, and then it's the man behind the curtain. What's the line like? So
Oh yeah, from
then
Wizard
you,
of Oz.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is.
Right.
It's that line. Pay no attention to the man
Yes.
behind the curtain, right?
Right.
That's just like he's got his anti-Semitism, handle, and he's pushing that, and and it's like it's all completely phony. Like
Right.
it's I mean, look at what the ADL, for example, which is a hate group, and they gin up anti-Semitism everywhere they can. Look at who, I remember during COVID, they said that anti-vax is a new variant of anti-Semitism.
Right.
So it's like any corporate interest that pays the ADL will say that criticism of that corporate interest or whatever it is anti-Semitism. It's just so obviously fake. And so if you buy into Zionism or anywhere in that narrative, then you're end up supporting that thing, that whole paradigm. It's just like you just gotta, once people understand that it's completely fake, there's nothing real about it. It's like artificial flavor. It's like comparing artificial like a watermelon Jolly Rancher to an actual watermelon. It's like this is not the same,
Right.
then it just all falls apart and you can really see through the PSYOP.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said, man. I genuinely think that more people than not are starting to see it. And maybe still getting kind of trapped in some of these misunderstandings because they do jump in their circles and their sides on Twitter and elsewhere, and they see some large account trying to draw them over here with flashy claims. But I genuinely think that most people are, because they do. I think a lot of them. I mean, I have more of a hopeful perspective right now on whether it's the two-party illusion, the U.S. in general, or the world perspective. But I am leaning more towards people are seeing it, and I think that's why a lot of this is happening. It's kind of a desperate kind of implosion because. What else are they going to do besides double down on the same lies? And it's not working, So, and I think your work, Dan, is having a huge effect on that. So thank you for taking the time today, talking about this. Hopefully we can connect again in the near future. And I'll include, by the way, as always, all of your links and, for people to check out your different accounts, as well as your link tree. Make sure you support the work he's doing. It's very important. So thank you again, Dan. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Zionism is racism. Israel cannot be both. Israel is either a racist Jewish state or it's a democratic state for everybody. And that's what I would like Israel to be. I'd like a democratic solution, one state with equal rights for all its inhabitants. Your organization, Human Rights Watch, issued a report last year about Israel, and the conclusion was it is an apartheid state. And there are 4 major human rights groups in the last 2 years who issued similar reports, reached the same conclusion. Israel is an apartheid state. So apartheid is racism. Apartheid is discrimination. But Israel is the only member of the United Nations that I know which is officially racist. And I say this because of the July 2018 nation-state law, which says the Jews have a unique right to self-determination in Israel. Unique means exclusive.
Yes.
It means Arabs have no right to self-determination. It means even if Arabs became a majority, they would still have no right to self-determination. So most certainly Zionism is a racist ideology, and it is largely responsible for the Nakba that has unfolded throughout the last century and continues today.